fact that the Me Too movement surprised men more than women. Sexual harassment and assault have scarred the lives of many women in one way or another. Until this recent wave of revelations, most men were, at best, oblivious to the plight of their mothers, daughters, and wives, and heedlessly blind to the impact of their own harassing and abusing behavior. How does the Me Too movement affect the identity and social responsibility of men? Hugh Taft-Morales will explore how we can best honor the courage fueling the Me Too movement and honor the worth of all women.
Thank you, Don. I have handouts of some of the selections of my talk today, but I will say I had these Xeroxed before and then forgot to correct. It is not the University of Michigan that had the coach for the Olympic team working under their administration. It was Michigan State, yes. So for the Wolverines that came up to me this past week and told me I better correct that, I corrected it in my talk, but it was not the University of Michigan, it was Michigan State. So today I'm talking about #MeToo, Men and Responsibility. A year after the Women's March, when people with pink hats flooded through the streets in a new wave of feminism. The day after the inauguration, the most publicly sexist president in my lifetime, at least, was elected. Women took the battle against sexism and misogyny to the streets. Now, this talk was very difficult for me to prepare for two general reasons. First, there's so much to cover. I can't do in 30 minutes what needs to be said on this topic. It touches on so much of our lives and our relationships. It's hard to deal with, first of all, any of the topic, but the history of sexual politics, which was addressed by author Kate Millett, which I finally read, a classic from 1970. Couldn't deal with all of her insights. I couldn't critique the so-called men's rights movement, which is a rather frightening, curious movement. I didn't have time to delve into the corrosive elements of shame that surrounds sex and sexuality in our culture. That is going to be another future talk of mine. I cannot point out all the binary and cisgendered assumptions that are made in a talk like this and in talking about this issue. Again, having to touch on in the future. And I can't do, for example, justice to the horror of violence against trans folks. So, as I said, those will have to be addressed along with a lot of other issues. But the second reason it was a difficult thing to prepare was my own awareness that I have not been always responsible, particularly in my adolescence and young adulthood. I mean, I know I've been insensitive and self-centered regarding sex and sexuality, and even today, despite my commitment to feminism, I still unconsciously perpetuate aspects of patriarchy. I did it in this talk, and each time I wrote it over, I said, there's another one, there's another example. So I hope this talk helps me and helps other men do better, because we have to do better. Now, I focused on the fact that men can start by exploring why, in general, men were more surprised than women over the Me Too movement. The hashtag has been used for a long time by social activist Tarana Burke, but was everywhere after Harvey Weinstein's sexist behavior became national news and the actress Alyssa Milano encouraged survivors of sexual abuse to speak out. It was first led by female celebrities. Many did speak about sexual abuse. It was a way to feel less alone, a way to say that it has to stop, a way to sense a sense of solidarity over an issue with which most women are all too familiar. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 3 women have been victims of sexual violence. Many more have been hurt by nonviolent but powerful sexism and abuse, including the taboo against speaking out against abuse. Now, it's true that men are also sometimes victims of sexual violence and abuse and harassment, and sometimes women abuse men, but I'm going to explore that when I critique the men's rights movement. Today, I'm going to focus on the overwhelming percentage of victims being women, and an even more overwhelming percentage of the perpetrators are men. Now, that's not a surprise, but I'm going to start with that. Now, the Me Too movement surprised even those who considered themselves allies of feminism. I think we were unprepared for the breadth and the depth of the accusations and how many of our favorite personalities in the public were caught up in it. A lot of people wondered, either out loud or to themselves, what does this say about our culture now? Can I still watch Woody Allen movies?
Can I tell Bill Cosby jokes? What does it mean about dating culture? Can I root for the Michigan State teams? Can I listen to old reruns of The Prairie Home Companion? And so on and so on. Now, some men, I think, were just ignorant of what was going on. Some were oblivious, but most of us were unprepared, I believe. Most women saw this coming. When harassment's discussed, women often nod in agreement and in sympathy and in solidarity. A close friend of mine in an all-female book club asked the group who had been a victim of sexual abuse, and nearly everybody in the group raised their hands. It's a common experience for women. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, and sometimes deeply wounding. It can even be fatal. So today I'm going to focus on the world of entertainment because that's where this particular wave of feminism and the Me Too movement began. 1 month after the New York Times broke the story about Harvey Weinstein, my wife and I attended what I assumed would be a light little musical at Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. It was called the Pajama Game. I don't know if you remember it, but I went in with this heavy realization of the Me Too movement, and as it began to roll out the plot, I began to feel uncomfortable. Because in it, it's a story about Sid, who is a floor manager in a pajama factory, and a young woman he has amorous feelings for named Babe. There's the setup, right? Anyway, when Babe starts to organize the union and form a grievance committee, Sid offers the most cringeworthy of all the lines in the play, and that is, well, all I can say is you're the cutest grievance committee I ever had to deal with. Yeah. And I don't know whether I would have thought that the same way then had it happened 6 months ago, because my awareness is not always key to these issues. But he pursued Babe romantically, even though he was her supervisor. Now, years ago, certainly this scene would not have made anybody think twice, because Time magazine pointed out that, quote, it wasn't long ago that the boss chasing his secretary around the desk was a comic trope, a staple from vaudeville to primetime sitcoms. But for me, it's precisely that normalization of that behavior that makes it so insidious and so powerful. It allows many people to laugh off locker room talk because, oh, that's just something we laugh about. It allows society in general, I think, to remain oblivious to this omnipresent sexual harassment and abuse. Now, this normalization of harassment really incensed my wife, Maureen, when she read that the Kennedy Center was going to give its Mark Twain Prize for American Humor to David Letterman. Now, I had been a longtime fan of David Letterman, even after I'd stopped watching it. But here was a man who admitted to having adulterous sex with multiple female staffers, many of whom blamed him for, quote, a hostile work environment and an atmosphere that is demeaning to women. While ignoring these revelations and scandals, on the eve of the Kennedy Center honors, a fawning male Washington Post reporter gave a gloriously glowing article about David Letterman, ending about how good a dad he was. So my wife, in an effort to try to purge her fury over this, wrote a friend. She let me quote some of this, because David Letterman had talked at one point about bringing his young son into a men's room, and there was a condom machine, and his son asked him some questions, so he said, well, now I know I have to have the talk. And my wife wrote to her friend saying, I shudder to think what that talk will be about. Use your position of power to make women, co-workers, at the least uncomfortable. Have sex with your female employees whose careers you can make or break. Cheat repeatedly on your partner of decades, who is your mother, by the way, but whatever you do, wear a condom. So that sort of hypocrisy and shallowness was not even pointed out by that Washington Post article. Now, actually it was. It was referred to vaguely, and I think they called it sort of accusations, as opposed to the truth. He admitted adultery on air. But even when he did it, he managed to shame women. He said, I have had sex with women who worked on this show, and it would be embarrassing, and would it be embarrassing if it were made public? Perhaps it would, especially for the women. So he was trying to make light of it in a way, and maybe even make fun of himself, but Erin Madison of the National Organization of Women pointed out that that plays into the same old sex stereotypes that men can do whatever they want, but women should be ashamed of their sexuality. She said, "We're just disgusted that all these Hollywood men think they can do whatever they want." Now, my wife continued this letter. She said, "I wish that the Kennedy Center would think about the entirety of what the comedian it honors are teaching and preaching, and place David Letterman in the Hall of Shame where he belongs, along with Harvey Weinstein, not as a recipient of its highest prize." And what came through to me is that I had overlooked that for decades, in a way, or laughed it off, or just didn't focus on it. And so I really, in some ways, aided and abetted that behavior in our culture. For years, I've been a fan of Woody Allen. When I was a young boy, I got to meet him because my grandmother knew him. I got to see him in a small room playing his clarinet in a band, and I always loved his movies. When allegations of sexual abuse rose more than a decade ago, I kept watching his movies. More recently, I heard that his adopted daughter, Dylan Farrow, claimed that Allen sexually assaulted her when she was a child. Now, Richard Morgan wrote in the Washington Post just last month an article that really tipped the scales for me, finally, perhaps. Morgan spent months going through a 56-box, 6-decade archives of Woody Allen that is being stored at Princeton University. And nobody had gone into it as much, the librarian said, as he did. And he concluded, quote, "From the very beginning to the very end, Allen drips with repetitious misogyny." After all, Allen's films often focus on older men, quite often played by Allen, in romantic relationships with young girls, who are, quote, "compelled to lackluster men merely by the gravity of the men's obsession." That I found fascinating. It's almost like that's reason enough that the man was so focused that the woman had to eventually succumb. Morgan said that Allen's personal notes tracked his obsession with young women and female characters as sexual objects who, as the scripts went through, the women got younger and younger and more vulnerable to men. He said that the notes show that Allen focuses on parts of the body, particularly legs and breasts. Morgan describes how Allen sees, quote, "the function of women in his life as they're begging to be a part of it." Now, Morgan admits that if you put the issue of child abuse to the side, and that's a huge if, quote, "there's nothing criminal about an 82-year-old's fixation with 18-year-old girls. It's not whip out your penis, button under the desk bad, but it's deeply anachronistically gross." Now, Allen's self-awareness almost makes this creepier. He described an affair that he had with the daughter of his partner for 12 years, Mia Farrow, right? You know how that worked out. Mia Farrow's adopted daughter, Allen had an affair with her while he and Mia Farrow were still in a relationship. And this is how he describes it. "I was paternal. She responded to someone paternal. I liked her youth and energy. She deferred to me." I mean, there's so much wrapped up in that finally tipped the scales, and I'm not going to watch another Woody Allen movie. I can't do it. I can't say I can love the art but hate the artist. It's too creepy. And I'm not proud of the fact that it took me till my 61st year to figure this out. Film critic Ann Hornaday, writes for The Post, said that sexism in Hollywood is so systemic that it's taken as normal. She said, quote, "It's a chain that begins in acting class when young women are encouraged to make themselves emotionally and physically vulnerable. It extends to dictatorial film sets and goes all the way to the screen, where they're often objectified and hypersexualized for the supposed benefit of male viewers who are habitually mistaken for the norm." So this normalization of sexism and sexual abuse in the world, including Hollywood bubble and the rest of society, leads men to be less aware of the personal and historical and systemic aspects of patriarchy. And in the hyped up world of Hollywood, powerful women were able to magnify this with the Me Too movement, and this helped women without power speak up. It helped show how widespread it is. And that's why it was so important that in the Time Magazine Person of the Year edition, which were the women of Me Too, that average women without power were also featured along with the celebrities. The editor-in-chief of Time, Edward Featherstall, said, "It began as great social change nearly always does with individual acts of courage. The biggest test of the movement will be the extent to which it changes the reality of people for whom telling the story simply threatens too much." So it's hard to stand up to harassment if you've got 2 young children to feed, if you're working 2 jobs, if you're below the poverty line, if you're undocumented and 1 phone call could see you sent back and your children left in this country. It's simply too dangerous. And then you take people with disabilities or children without power, and that's even more tragic in some ways. So the courage of those people who were not celebrities to speak out is what inspired me the most about this movement. Now, many women are able to withstand the lewd comments and the forced gropes that accompany their daily lives, but they often still blame themselves. Time magazine reported that all of the women they interviewed for the Me Too article described a palpable sense of shame. They wondered, what did they do to ask for it? They asked themselves over and over what they could have done to prevent it. And it doesn't matter if they did everything appropriately. For many, the shame still remains, perhaps all of their lives. Women who do speak out get labeled as troublemakers to attack or victims to ignore. One said, "Your complaint can become your identity." That's not what they wanted in their lives, to be identified as the victim. Other people blame them for overreacting. Misogynists can call them things like feminazis or bitches or other insulting sexualized language. And even their mentors, whether these men are teachers or coaches or bosses or clergy or police officers or judges or presidents. So while this is currently at the center of our national debate, it's been occurring for centuries. I read most of Kate Millett's book. I'm going to try to speak on it as a full talk in a few months. But it began teaching me a little bit more about the sexualization of power. And I learned things like how the sexual revolutions were often co-opted by men for their own advantage. I learned a lot about that, but I still need to know more to feel comfortable speaking about it. I knew a lot about Millett's historical analysis. I knew how chivalry was used to control women. I knew about what was called Republican motherhood in the early 1800s, along with the Victorian gilded cage, which used domestic duties and obsolete and incorrect psychology to keep women from going into business and government. And since this edition was put out in 1970, women are still regularly dismissed and doubted. I mean, Paula Jones was doubted for her accusations of Bill Clinton. Anita Hill was doubted after testifying about sexual harassment by Clarence Thomas. Feminist groups were even blamed by Jerry Falwell for being part of the reason for the 9/11 attack. And the reason why those attacks work is the normalization of these offensive stereotypes. So it's not so surprising that it took 10 years and more than 50 accusers to bring Bill Cosby to trial, or 80 accusers to disarm Harvey Weinstein. Backlash comes in all forms. I've mentioned a few of them. There's common stereotyping, portraying women as overreactive or hypersensitive or hysterical. I mean, when Garrison Keillor was accused, he said that he was being fired for merely, quote, touching a woman's bare back. And he bemoaned, "If this is harassment, then every friendship must be abusive." So again, discounting. Well, Minnesota Public Radio, after these sorts of comments by him, decided to let out everything they knew. And they said that they interviewed 60 people who described, quote, "a long pattern of behavior that left several women who worked for Keillor feeling mistreated, sexualized, or belittled." So it wasn't one bare back. Even Woody Allen was involved in the backlash. He warned about a, quote, witch hunt atmosphere, a Salem atmosphere, where every guy in an office who winks at a woman is suddenly having to call his lawyer. And I wonder whether such hyperbole hid from Allen the irony that he was referring to Salem, a place where men executed women. Probably went right over his head. Meanwhile, employees who seem more concerned about their bottom line, one of the trends since the Me Too movement is they're increasing their employment liability insurance so that they don't get hurt in the bottom line due to sexual harassment allegations. Backlash also comes from women. Most recently, there was that case of Aziz Ansari and a woman called Grace who he was dating, and Grace wrote about the unpleasant date she had with him, and Kate Flanagan in The Atlantic speculated that perhaps Grace hoped, quote, to become the famous man's girlfriend. And when that fell through, she wrote 3,000 words of revenge porn. I don't think the writer knew the reality behind it, but that sort of accusation is so disarming and abusive and powerful. Because a lot of women piled on, defenders of Aziz, because Aziz has been a feminist in many cases. But that's the point. Men who think that they're allies also can prop up patriarchy. The most vociferous backlash came from this men's rights movement, and I'm not going to go into this extremely explosive issue, but it's made up by people like an author called Warren Farrell and Paul Elam, who is the head of a group called A Voice for Men. And I admit that these groups are talking about some things that are important to correct. Things like the family court system sometimes tilts away from men, or at least that's the narratives that they're getting out there. And there are certainly examples where men are victims of essentialist gender roles and stereotypes. That's true too. But the men's rights movement also serves as a platform for a lot of misogyny, and it doesn't hide the fact of that. You can just go online and read some of the comments. And it's also been accused of perpetuating what many people call rape culture in this country. So I'm going to have to go into that later. But a recent film about that called The Red Pill paints a very sympathetic picture of these reasonably sounding men's rights activists speaking up for, quote, men who have been screwed over by a corrupt and oppressive family court system and those who don't want to be. But this documentary doesn't do enough to show the uglier side of it. It doesn't offer sufficient feminist rebuttals. So, if you see it, just go in with a grain of salt. So, the second part of my talk is going to focus on men's responsibilities now. What men can do. And to start, men can begin to listen to and learn from women. And this means that men, I think, should focus more on the women's rights movement than the men's rights movement. So that's sort of my meta perspective on the men's rights movement. Most importantly, they have to start believing women. I mean, why does it take 10 or 20 or 100 women to overcome the denial of one repeated abuser? I admit maybe it's complicated when it involves celebrities that we don't know. There's a he said, she said issue that's hard to sort out. But men can at least start believing women that they know and they trust when these women talk about sexual harassment. Too often men, again, teachers, police, government officials, authority figures, determine what does or doesn't count as sexual harassment and abuse, which is backwards. The people who are hurt should be the ones teaching about what hurts. Ashley Judge said, if something feels wrong, it's wrong. And it's wrong by my definition, not necessarily someone else's. Most deplorable of all the examples of women not being listened is the case of Larry Nasser, the doctor who worked at Michigan State and for the U.S. gymnastics team. I mean, it took over 100 accusers publicly to convince the world that this man of authority and power had been abusing women for 26 years. Many parents didn't believe what their daughters told them, and many felt deep guilt. One parent committed suicide, and the people think it was wrapped up in that guilt. 14 officials from the Michigan State were told what was going on, but didn't believe any of the accusers. Public record, 14. Probably more in other ways. One victim said a university official, quote, had the audacity to tell me I didn't understand the difference between sexual assault and a medical procedure. Columnist Petrula Dvorak for the Post wrote of this, quote, breathtaking display of doubt and dismissal that so often greet women and girls when they report being molested or raped or harassed. The prosecutor in Nasser's case said, what does it say about our society when victims who do come forward are automatically met with skepticism and doubt, treated as liars until proven true? Nasser had the audacity to tell the judge in a letter that, quote, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I mean, so twisted, and yet I know there are men in this country that heard that and said, yeah, sure, I know it, and had sympathy for him. That nauseating remark makes me realize how far we have to go. Believe women, believe women. The second way that men can be responsible is to examine how they personally act in their lives. Men can admit and correct our own sexist and patriarchal biases and behaviors. I, for one, want to own up to the collective sexism of my gender and myself. When I was young, I was struck by a particular theme in the book by Jonathan Irving, The World According to Garp. In that book, the protagonist, Garp, is wrestling with the ugly realities of misogyny and rape and humiliation, infidelity, on both sides of the gender divide. And he feels that his own maleness makes him responsible for the violence against women. In Garp's mind, he said that, quote, rape was an act that disgusted him with himself, with his very own male instincts, which were so otherwise unassailable. He never felt like raping anyone, but rape, Garp thought, made men feel guilt by association. And that resonated in my mind when I was young, and I felt responsible for my gender. I still do. That's why I agree with joining this movement, trying to speak out, trying to admit. One blogger on Shattering the Ceiling website wrote that men, quote, need to step up and do their part. In plain speak, this blogger continued, and I loved this very clear language, publicly own your shit. Hold yourself accountable. Men should be posting times they've looked away, stayed silent, laughed it off, or harder still, been the ones doing the harassing and abusing themselves. This happens not just in bars and clubs, but also in classrooms, hallways, churches, conventions, offices, grocery stores, and sidewalks. You, men, have seen it, and you've chosen to stay out of it. And that's very often true, myself included. Just this past week, Wayne sent me an article about Dan Harmon. I don't know how many of you have seen it. He's the TV show creator of Community, a network show. And he had harassed a female writer, Megan Gans, and he said on air that he was, quote, flirty, creepy, everything that overt enough to constitute betraying your live-in girlfriend. So he was cheating basically on his live-in girlfriend. He gave a detailed admission on air, and Harmon said that the female colleagues had told him he needed to talk about how he'd been part of the problem. He wanted to make a sincere apology a part of the process. He wanted to normalize apologies. But he was very aware that he didn't want to make Gans feel re-victimized or attacked. So you can't just blurt out your confession without talking to those who you have harmed. Otherwise, it's another wound. You're using it to clean yourself, to feel better. So you really have to be careful in these cases. But Gans had said that Harmon did a good job of his apology. You can find it on air, WHYY. No, what's the public radio station? WYPR. Thank you, WYPR. Thank you. HYY's Philly. Harmon said, the most clinical way I can put it is fessing up to my crimes is that I was attracted to a writer I had power over because I was a showrunner, and I knew enough to know that these feelings were bad news. But he didn't listen to himself. He said, quote, I crushed on her and resented her for not reciprocating it. The entire time I was the one writing her paychecks, and in control of whether she stayed or went and whether she felt good about herself or not. And I said horrible things. I just treated her cruelly. So owning your own shit. Maybe there should be a new hashtag for men to admit that. We can have more difficult conversations with each other, men with men. And we can have more difficult conversations with women when women ask us to have those conversations. I don't think it's up to men to initiate this or say, this is the time I want to deal with this. I think men also need to study the gray areas, gray at least for men. Aziz Ansari's case, for example, and again, there's another person I loved, and he was progressive, he was like a hero in a lot of ways, but he admitted that he misread signs when he took Grace back to his apartment and made her feel very uncomfortable by his pressing for sex. When it became totally obvious, it's true, Ansari called a cab and apologized to Grace the next day. But he was probably not sensitive enough to her feelings. I certainly don't think he was aware enough of the power dynamic that could have existed between a 23-year-old woman and a 35-year-old megastar. And when you have that power, you must be cognizant of that. So men need to study this more often. That radio program with Dan Harmon, one of the discussions they were having is how hard it is to parse the differences between the levels of sexual harassment. But we obviously have to parse the levels of sexual harassment. We need more conversations. We need to educate ourselves more about it, especially when it is something that is something that we engage in. I mean, obviously, sexual abuse should stop. Sexual attack should stop. But we should try to be ridding the world of bad consensual sex. Sex that is negatively affected by a power dynamic or an awkward situation. We have to do that, and we have to do it now. We have to do it because many men weren't taught that when they were children. So men have to educate themselves now in some very basic ways. Obviously, we have to teach our children, boys and girls. We have to teach them to trust their bodies, to own their own bodies. We have to teach them that no means no, that silence is not consent. We have to teach them that for girls, it's not rude to reject boys. We have to teach boys not to think that it's okay to wear down women by incessantly pleading for sex. We have to teach children to talk openly about sexuality and birth control, sex, so that children don't have to learn hurtful behavior from an unmonitored internet. We have to confront abstinence-only curricula, which quite often has very sexist and misogynist approaches. I mean, this is more subtle, but one curriculum said that girls need to be aware that they may be able to tell when a kiss is leading to something else. The girl may need to put the brakes on first in order to help the boy. Girls need to be careful with what they wear because males are looking. And over and over and over again, excusing the males for sex drive and putting the responsibility back on women. Men and boys have to be responsible. Most importantly, perhaps, men have to take political responsibility for sexism, correcting sexist laws, sexist practices. And we have to clean up, for example, the incompetence of a lot of police departments where thousands of rape kits are going unprocessed. And then after a certain amount of time, they can't be used in court. So even evidence collected at a traumatized moment for a lot of women is thrown out the window. Not a message of respect and concern. We have to update our sexual harassment policies, maybe even change the statute of limitations. I know that gets people, but quite often when young women are traumatized, it takes more than the statute of limitations to get to the point where they can bring charges. Maybe men should demand that publicly traded companies, these are companies that are privileged by our taxpayer regulatory agencies, okay? We are paying for the regulation for many of these public companies, all of them if they're public. They have to be held to a higher standard. So how about if we make it illegal for these publicly traded companies to force women to sign non-disclosure agreements? All people. Non-disclosure agreements, which means that you can't even offer a sexual harassment suit. And you can't talk about it, certainly. How about if public companies are forced to inform their shareholders when the company uses company funds to pay off settlements? They don't. They hide it from their shareholders. Nobody knows. What do we do with elected officials who cover up their sexual harassment and abuse? One case alone, Representative Hastings was accused by harassment by staffer Winsome Packer. Well, he's still in Congress. She got a $220,000 settlement, but she wished she had not had that problem at all. She said, quote, "I lost my career, I lost 1/3 of my pension, lost my security clearance, and I lost many friends." And you know who paid the $220,000? Not Representative Hastings, you and me, taxpayer funds that are set aside in Congress to deal with suits like this. So maybe we can advocate for the Me Too Congress bill. Maybe men should want to hold our elected representatives accountable. This bill would facilitate the filing of complaints, the elimination of non-disclosure agreements as a condition for filing a complaint. It would create a new in-house counsel to assist people accusing others of harassment, and it would require lawmakers to pay their own sexual harassment claims. So to conclude my talk, I want to refer to Dana Milbank's Washington Post column about the Second Women's March that occurred last month, and how the man in the White House tweeted, and I quote, "Beautiful weather for all over our great country, a perfect day for women to march," as he instructed women to, quote, "get out there and celebrate the historic milestones of his presidency." I mean, what an example of arrogance or ignorance or both. I don't even know anymore. This is from the man whose own misogynist attitudes and behaviors led to the wearing of pink hats as a political statement against sexual abuse. So I leave myself and all men with one last suggestion for now about what to do. Support female candidates. How about that? When less than 25% of our congresspeople are women. The best thing our current president ever did is perhaps he started a revolution. Since the last Women's March, the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers said that women are running for or planning to run for Congress and other offices at a record pace. 49 women are in the running for Senate, 389 for the House, 79 for governorships. Whether they come to fruition or not, we don't know. But at the very least, we can consider that maybe power needs to be shared more equitably to get more equitable laws and to be able to take women seriously. So one thing we can do as men is be responsible, vote for women. Thank you very much.